effectively, this page hasn't changed in 15 some odd years. Text box, 2 buttons. Interesting note about this page, probably about 15 years ago, this page experienced a performance problem. I don't know if you all are familiar with this, but 15 years ago when we were still in the world of dial-up, we started with a blank page and then the page would slowly start loading in pieces. At what point do you determine whether, or as a user, that this page is actually loaded? To solve this problem, what Google did is where we see, we didn't have the menus before, but they added a copyright. And that was the key for users to know whether or not this page was actually loaded or not and ready to be used or interacted with. So when we ask the question whether or not this page is loaded, it would look similar to something like this. It's very basic. There's not a lot that can go wrong here. It's simple. This is, again, simple question, simple answer. However, not every page is that simple. You run across pages like this. There's a lot going on here. Again, we have a search box and we have a search button. But what else do we need to test for? You could make the argument, well, hey, the page is, if I've got those 2 pieces of information, I'm ready to go. I'm loaded. What about the trending now box? What about the weather? What about that left sidebar with all those menu items on there? What about those news articles? Would anybody say that it is okay to not have those things loaded? I would venture to say not. So what does it mean to load that page? Well, again, we have a query and we have a search and we have that left sidebar, but this list will continue to go on and on and on and on. These 2 examples that I just showed you assume that you have a query element defined. Lord forbid that you actually have to ask the driver to go find some elements and go get the 3rd one and then make sure that that's the one I'm really talking about and then test that it's available or ready to go. So again, my isLoaded method becomes very hairy, becomes unscalable, and very much not maintainable. So how do we answer this? Well, good engineering practices dictate that we use patterns. Where we work, we hire nothing but engineers. So we really don't have a QA functional manual tester. Everybody is an engineer and everybody is responsible for understanding good engineering practices and principles. So why do we use patterns? Well, we have convention over configuration. When we talk about patterns, it's a shorthand for something that we all have in common. Or a common shared understanding of a certain value. So when we talk about patterns, one of the patterns that we use extensively is the factory pattern. It's pretty straightforward. I ask for a piece or a widget. Here's some information to describe this widget, and the factory takes care of all of the complexities of building said widget and then returning to me what it is that I asked for. In particular, we have a page factory that we use. We give it a couple pieces of information. We will then expect that page to come back. To give you some idea, we have probably about 10 distinct pages. And then we take those, we have multiple different types of themes that somebody could select from. So if I have 3 themes, now all of a sudden I have 30 pages. And then we're going to turn pieces on and off. So that page factor becomes very important for us. The key being that I do not want to clutter up my page object. So I'm not going to go to a lot of detail about the page object. If you're all familiar with it, we've got a load method, we've got an isLoaded method. The page object describes a loadable component. If you so your page could be that loadable component. Your page could comprise of several loadable components. I would point out that if you have questions about how does a page object pattern work, what does it look like, Selenium, the website, has provided an excellent example and description of how to do this and what it should look like. Once you give that a read, it really is pretty straightforward and self-explanatory, really. So What I'm really after is the command pattern. I don't know how many people are familiar with the command pattern. Before we started this, I certainly was not familiar with the command pattern. So let me give you a brief explanation. You can read about it on Wikipedia. You can read about it in the Head Start Patterns book. However, both of those explanations didn't seem to penetrate with me, and so I've explained it like this. I assume everybody in this room either has a driver's license or has ridden in a vehicle with somebody who has a driver's license. I hope so anyway. And when you come to a stoplight and that light is red, what do? Well, we all apply the brake and we come to a complete stop. Well, how did you know that? Well, at some point, somebody told you that you see a red light, you need to come to a complete stop. So now you're sitting there waiting. For what? Next week? Christmas? You're waiting for the green light. So how did you know what the green light meant? Well, at some point, somebody had to tell you the green light, let's go, apply the accelerator. Now, before you can do these things, somebody explained those things to you, okay? They explained some commands to you, and given the appropriate signal at the appropriate time, you applied those commands. That essentially is the command pattern. So in our particular case, we have a command factory. This command factory knows everything about our commands, or at least knows where to find these commands and how to create them. One of the key things here is when you write your test, as a tester, you pretty much know already before we even execute what should be on that page. So if we already know what's going to be on that page, we can ask the command factory for the exact same piece of information. So then that command factory is going to return to us some is-loaded commands. These commands know what to test and they know how to test. So for instance, the query box on those search engines, we'll make a simple assumption that you have a web element called query, and we're just going to make a simple assumption that as long as it's visible, it's testable. And so all of a sudden you can see you have a command there. These commands are then passed on to the page factory. The page factory needs to know this information to marry together both of the commands and the pages that we're trying to build. Then, at some point in the future, the page will actually execute those is-loaded commands, just like in our stoplight. Then, as described, is-loaded commands will determine whether or not the page is loaded. So note here that the page didn't actually determine whether or not the page itself was loaded. The is-loaded commands determined whether or not the page was loaded. So now all of a sudden, my page object really has no concept of whether or not it's even ready to go. It's relying on another piece. So that other piece, again, good engineering practices say that we need to have an interface here. The reason why we have to have this interface is because we can have multiple different types of commands for multiple different types of pages. We want our page object to not know about what it takes. So all of a sudden, we've talked about, well, let me take a step back. So we've talked about these factories that whisk away our wonderful, complex object creation. We have the is-loaded commands that whisk away what it is to determine what actually is loaded, and our page is left to do one thing, which is to perform actions on a page. Another way of putting this is separation of concerns. So good engineering principle there as well, right? In our interface, we're curious about one thing and one thing only. Is this thing loaded? Yes or no? So when we talk about that query box, what does that query box look like? Well, we have a simple query is loaded. It's going to implement my is loaded interface. We've got a web element query. Pass it to the driver. We're going to go find it however you need to go find it. ID, path, whatever it takes. And then there's our simple is loaded method. It's very straightforward. It's very simple. That's the key. Again, the concrete classes, just to reiterate, will determine the what and how. So, this has been pretty brief, but with our isLoaded commands, our page factories, our command factories, and our page objects, our page isLoaded method ends up becoming this. So as you can see, previously, I had this list in the isLoaded method that would go on and on and on. It is trying to query it's trying to find elements that may or may not exist on the page. As these elements are added to the page, I no longer have to mess with my page object. The factories take care of all that for me. So then the question is my page loaded? And the question we had with that, or the concern we had is, this is a simple question. I would advocate that this answer that I present is a simple answer. 3 key points here being that we've separated our concerns, we're using patterns, and we've kept the problem, we've now made this problem a simple problem to answer. That is how we know whether or not our page is loaded. So, are there any questions? There in the back. Okay, so the question is how do we handle JavaScript that has to load in the background? So again, they're in the concrete classes, they're on the isLoaded commands. That's where you're going to determine whether or not your JavaScript has completed loading. So if you need to pass in more things for that particular command, then at the command factory we'll know how to do that, because we've explained to the command factory that this is about what this page is going to look like. Okay? And so that command factory there at that point will determine, okay, which one are we talking about, where are we talking about, and create the appropriate command. Those commands then will determine whether or not my JavaScript has finished loading, whether or not it's there, so on and so forth. So it's all in that concrete class. Yes?
I noticed in your isLoaded, at the same commands it asserts.
Yes.
Now, that means that it's possible that you failed, but even though you failed to assert it could be loaded enough to execute your test.
So my question, okay, so the question is there's an assert in the isLoaded. If you're following the page object pattern, you're already aware that that's how we determine whether or not a page is loaded. And so then the question he's asking is, we're asserting and it's failed, but the page is indeed loaded. I would propose back to you, is it?
Because you're asserting it.
Right? If the assertion failed, did it load appropriately? And if you're going to assert back to me that yes, it did indeed load correctly, then I would say that your assertion is wrong, or that your command that you're trying to implement is built in such a way it's not appropriate. So that, again, that's left up to you to implement appropriately based on the situation. Yes?
What actually calls the isLoaded method?
The page will. The page will actually call the isLoaded method. So all of your pages, that isLoaded method will look exactly like this. It's just a list of commands to iterate over. The command factory will be responsible for creating those commands and returning to the page factory eventually. If we take a step back. Oh. I think, yeah, so here we're going to create, the command factory creates a list of isLoaded commands and passes that on to the page factory. And so that's how we're going to do that. Yes?
Usually you don't need all the elements in your page in a particular test. You just need a few of them. So why wait for all the elements loading in the page?
Okay, great question. So the question is, at some point you're not particularly interested in every element. So why do I need to wait for every element to load? Great question. So at first when we started playing with this, we got a little overzealous. If you looked at that Yahoo page, I mean, we were testing for every one of those menu items, everything that you could possibly conceive of. What you've quickly realized is that you spend a lot of time in your is loaded or testing to see if the page is actually loaded. And really all we want to know in this, like Yahoo's case, is we're just trying to get to the results page. So what we've actually did is, depending on what we're testing for, we customize what will actually go into those is loaded, that list of commands. So we're not necessarily looking for everything. If our intent at the particular page is to get to the next page, and we're not necessarily concerned about anything about the first page, then yes, by all means, what we will do is we will eliminate some of those. So there's like a shorthand or a smoke type determination made to whether or not the page is loaded. But so I would say there that the answer to the question would be is you have to determine your own level or threshold of pain, because performance does matter. As you saw in the previous speakers, performance becomes a huge problem, and so then you need to weigh the cost benefit of testing for everything or just testing for the few pieces that you need. Yes? Okay, so the question is does the test determine what to wait for? No, actually it does not. What the test can do is it'll ask the command factory for the isLoaded. So it asks the isLoaded command factory. It'll give it some pieces of information. So in particular in our case, what we do is we can tell it, I want you to randomly select, and then I can give it a number of things to select for. I can tell it, I can pat the test in your before method, or your before class will determine, or you'll know beforehand what it is that you want to test for in this particular case. And then you can tell the command factory, hey, I need to return this. Most of our commands actually go and hit a database to get some personalization attributes about our affiliates and how they want their pages to load. You can imagine that since they can turn things on and off, the certain elements are not always there. So before the test is even ran, we have a pretty good idea. So we may go to the database and turn certain things off and then create our commands based on a new piece of information. So the test beforehand, that's the key, is that the test beforehand knows how to test for something. Any other questions? Yes, back there in the back. No. So the question is, do we need to use some kind of wait to occur? We try to strive to never use a sleep. We never sleep anything. Every once in a while, we will throw in a wait condition. If you're familiar with the API, the Selenium API, you can use a wait condition. However, what we're talking about is a page load. I try to avoid using wait conditions there, and instead, whenever the page is asked to be loaded, of course, the first assertion fails. The driver then tries to actually get the page, and so that'll reload the page. The assumption here is that whenever the page first tries to load, it should indeed fail the assertion. If you look in the code, it'll catch that assertion error and then do a get on that page. And once the driver receives the, I think it's DOM complete event, then it'll try to assert again, run the isLoaded again. And so then that's that second time around. But rarely do we use a wait condition anywhere in our code. We let the framework or let Selenium determine when a page has actually been loaded or not.
So just to be clear, you're extending the loadable component object from the Selenium library?
Correct. That is correct. So the question is we are extending, whether or not we're extending loadable component for our page objects, and the answer is yes. So we fully utilize what Selenium has to offer. It's somebody, if Selenium breaks, the loadable component breaks, while yes, it is my problem, it's going to be Simon's job to fix it. So, any other questions? Back there in the back. Great question. So the question is how do we determine when we have dynamic content on the page? So if you recall on the Yahoo page, that news page, those news articles, fairly certain that that's not static. So the templates that we've built consume the API. So fortunately for us, I get to eat my own dog food here, and I have to consume that API. Now that API, it doesn't change very often, or I shouldn't say, it's not that it doesn't change very often, it's when our template requests for a page, and there's some dynamic content on there, it's making a request back to the API. My test makes the exact same request back to the API. So within a matter of milliseconds, there were 2 requests made. The catch there is that dynamic content does not change within milliseconds of each other. So we've narrowed that window. If that window was larger, perhaps we'd have a bigger problem. But currently, when we have dynamic content on the page, the way we answer that is just ask the API itself. The test does. So not only does the test, but then the application we're testing makes the exact same calls. And so that's how we know what that dynamic content is going to be and the contents of it. Back there and back.
Are you going to share a code sample that has all those pieces there?
Let's see. I might be able to do that.
Or is that easy to find online? Do lots of people do this?
No. The answer to that question is, so the question was, is there a code sample that I can share? I can bring up IntelliJ here and show you a piece of code that we have. And then the second part of that question was, have I seen this or does anybody else do this? No. That's why I brought it here today.
Can we download your example?
I can probably come up with an example that would illustrate this. I'm not going to hand out all this code. There are some sensitive things in there you can imagine. Okay. So here's my isLoaded command factory. Let's close those. So, excuse me. So essentially here, I've got this get Bravo common isLoaded commands. It's just pretty straightforward. This particular code is probably out of date by about 6 months or so. I've since moved on to a different project, and so this is when we were first starting this stuff. But as you can see, it's what we've passed in is a map of personalization attributes. The first thing we're doing, creating a list of commands. We determine whether or not these things are turned on. So in this particular case, language, currency, the FAQ, privacy, terms of use, those are all footer pieces. Displaying a price match guarantee piece of information, a promo code, TripAdvisor ratings and reviews. So that's a simple example of what that isLoaded command factory is. Those PZs are a database call to find out what they are, or what the personalization might look like. So alternatively, I could have copied all of this code and put it into my isLoaded page or my isLoaded method for every single page that has the locale button or the currency drop-down menu on it. So all of a sudden I'm duplicating code on every page. We all like to do that. Does that answer your question? I can probably come up with some better examples and apply those and show those, especially with everything that we talk about when we're here. So here's one of those concrete. It's short, it's simple. I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? How we glue all that together. Let me see if I can't find a test. Now you're going to see some of our dirty laundry. Because here's my favorite. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, these tests drive me bananas. As you can see, we're moving into a little bit better, starting to actually name them something reasonable. Maybe the auto-suggest test. Let's hope. Oh, there we go. So this particular test, you will note that before my class is even loaded, or my test even begins to run, again, we know what that get landing page is going to look like. And so pieces of information we need to know is obviously the driver, so we can find elements. CID, which just tells us who you are. The theme kind of tells us what kind of theme we're going to be talking about, and then those personalization attributes. Based on that, I have a list of commands now. Yeah, and so then I create a landing page, set my destination. There you go. Yeah. So some of them we do. So I can show you. Some of them we do. Let me see. So the question is how come we don't use lazy instantiation? We could definitely do that on some of these things. When you look at, in particularly, where is it? This command here, does lazy instantiation help us any? I would argue that it doesn't, because we're getting, whether I ask for it now by ID or I do it lazily, my runtime is not going to be affected one way or the other. So, you could call it sloppy, or we could argue about that. Really, I see it as 6 1/2 dozen the other. I don't get excited about things until it's worth getting excited about, and this is one of those things that I don't get excited about. Anything else? I will be leaving for Seattle here shortly, so you'll be able to contact me via the Twitter. Where was I? There. You can find this slide deck there at that URL. And then I've got a to-do list of provide some better concrete examples. Thank you.